In this video I will tell you what yeast to use for pizza dough. Spoiler alert, you can use any. Yes, you can use any yeast to make pizza dough or bread dough for the matter. No yeast is better than the other one, and I'm going to explain to you why. First off, let's consider the three main kinds of yeast we know. Number one is fresh yeast, also called compressed yeast or cake yeast. It's a compound that contains biological entities which belong to the fungus family. These little critters carry on their metabolism and they produce the gas that will make our dough nice and big and puffy, You can dissolve it into your water or maybe crumble it into the flour. There's no real difference, to be honest. This yeast used to be the only one available, and it's still very common in Italy, where I come from, if you didn't notice yet my beautiful accent. But it seemed to me that in general it's not very easy to find. Perhaps you can maybe ask your baker if you really want to try it. But anyway, that's not a problem, because somebody had the good idea of removing the water from fresh yeast in order to get dry yeast. This leads us to the other two kinds of yeast you find at the supermarket usually. The dry active yeast that comes in small granules. They are simply cells of yeast covered in starch. The manufacturer always suggests to activate it in water, where the starch will dissolve and the actual yeast will be released. Often they recommend adding a pinch of sugar to give a little initial boost to the yeast itself. And then there is the instant yeast. It comes in tiny sticks, and it doesn't need any special treatment. You can use it straight away. It's usually recommended to sprinkle it on top of the flour, since it will start its activity, its action, once it will meet the water. Basically, the commercial name instant yeast refers to the fact you really can use it straight away, skipping the activation phase needed for the active yeast. In fact, the very same yeast often has different commercial names like quick yeast, fast action yeast, anything related to its speed. Now, as I said, active and instant yeast come both from dehydration of fresh yeast. This means these three kinds of yeast contain the very same biological entity. And this means they all work in the same way. And this means there is no yeast you should prefer to make your dough, really. Also, the suggestions on how to use these two kinds of yeast are just suggestions. For example, I always dissolve my yeast in water, regardless of the one I have. My results are the same. If you want my recipe, actually, you can download my free ebook. I will leave you the link in the description of the video down here, where you will also find my Instagram and my Facebook pages. You should follow me to see all the pizzas I bake. Last but not least, you can use active yeast and instant yeast in the exact same amount. So if your recipe calls, for example, for 10 grams of active yeast, but you only have instant yeast, never mind, whatever, go ahead and use one instead of the other. Also, if you got any fresh yeast instead, then consider the 1-to-3 ratio. Well, 1-to-3 ratio. So if your recipe calls, for example, for 1 gram of dry yeast, you should use 3 grams of fresh yeast. If your recipe calls for 17 grams of dry yeast, you should use 51 grams of fresh yeast. Okay, hopefully you now know what yeast to use for pizza dough. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up and maybe share it with somebody who would like it. Leave me a comment down here to ask me more questions, to tell me what you think about it. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. Ciao for now.